Archivist T'Valor was not accustomed to the idea of the unexpected. As a member of the Xelari Dominion, one of the galaxy's oldest and most advanced civilizations, he was a creature of discipline and logic. His species valued precision, elegance, and, above all, order. In his role as an archivist, he was tasked with cataloging cultures, noting their behaviors, and, when necessary, appraising their value to the Dominion's ongoing dominance of the stars. Humanity, to T'Valor, was a footnote, an interesting but ultimately inconsequential species on the fringes of the intergalactic stage. The humans have been recent entrants into the vast sea of spacefaring species. Their first few encounters have been nothing short of chaotic, marked by technological clumsiness, emotional volatility, and a penchant for unnecessary conflict. The Xelari had analyzed their behavior, predictable and simple-minded. Their ships were cumbersome and outdated by galactic standards, and their social structures seemed disjointed. They fought wars over trivial matters. The humans had made little impact on the broader galactic community, and T'Valor had expected little more from the latest diplomatic exchange. As T'Valor entered the meeting room aboard the Dominion cruiser Vrethin, he noted the human delegation already seated in their section. The room was sterile, designed for formal communication, its metal surfaces reflecting the cold, polished grandeur that defines Xelari architecture. The humans were seated awkwardly, each with a posture that suggested discomfort in the precise environment. T'Valor could not help but feel a sense of mild amusement at their inability to adapt to such a structured setting. One human stood out among them, a woman, seemingly unremarkable at first glance. Captain Ava Ramirez, as her file described her. A mere human officer, unaugmented, unarmored, and, by all accounts, perfectly average. Her file included no remarkable achievements or feats. She was simply a captain of a human vessel, nothing more than an administrative detail on a page of records. However, as T'Valor approached, she caught his attention in a way the others did not. The humans, despite their best efforts to maintain composure, were inherently loud, their movements quick and uncoordinated. But Captain Ramirez? She moved with a quiet certainty. In a moment that seemed out of place amidst the mechanical conversations of the delegation, she reached into a small bag, produced a small ceramic container, and began pouring steaming liquid into small cups with a practiced hand. The aroma wafted through the air, an earthy, unfamiliar scent. She turned to T'Valor and offered him one of the cups with an inviting smile. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice warm and unguarded, the word floating into the air like an offering. T'Valor hesitated. In his many years of cataloging and analyzing the behaviors of lesser species, he had never encountered one so direct. No preamble, no formalities. Just a simple gesture of hospitality. It was absurd, of course. Coffee, like all neurostimulants, was a substance his body could not metabolize. He had no use for it. Yet, there was something disarming in her openness, in the unshielded warmth with which she extended the gesture. For a moment, T'Valor considered the oddness of it all, the simplicity, the honesty. His instinct told him to decline, as he always did. The decision was logical, rational, but something about the moment, something about her, made him pause. "No, thank you," he replied coolly, keeping his voice even. "We are unable to process your neurostimulants." She smiled, as if she had expected the answer. "That's all right. Not everyone likes coffee." T'Valor studied her for a moment. There was something about her eyes, vivid, lively, full of a kind of energy that he found hard to categorize. They were not like the cold, calculating eyes of his own kind, nor were they like the hollow, detached eyes of other species who had long given up hope for meaningful connection. Captain Ramirez's gaze held a strange vitality, a willingness to engage, to understand. Without waiting for him to say anything else, she sat down and gestured for him to join her. "Have you ever tried it?" she asked casually, as though discussing the weather. "It's not just the caffeine. It's the ritual, the heat of the cup in your hands, the first sip of something warm. It makes you feel alive." T'Valor's mind churned through the implications of her words. Ritual, warmth, alive. These were concepts he found entirely foreign. The Xelari believed in efficiency, in the precision of technology and knowledge. There was no room for emotional excess in their worldview. But as he sat across from her, watching the way she poured the liquid with such care, he felt an unfamiliar prickling at the back of his mind. Was she simply indulging in a human triviality, or was there something more profound at play here? "We are often too focused on survival," he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "Survival demands that we reject the frivolous. There is no place for such rituals." Ava's eyes twinkled at his words. "Maybe that's why you're missing the point." T'Valor's brows furrowed, and he was about to respond when she interrupted him, as if she knew the response was coming. "We've been through hell, but hell teaches you how to build fire." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. T'Valor blinked, unsure whether to dismiss them as the poetic ramblings of an emotional human or to consider the possibility that there was more beneath the surface. He had seen countless species reduce their culture to sayings and symbols meant to represent something deeper. Yet in that moment, there was something different in the way Captain Ramirez spoke. A conviction, a fierceness behind the softness of her words. And yet, it was still nonsense, wasn't it? Hell, fire, survival. He made a mental note of the phrase. Hell teaches you how to build fire, as he would any oddity in the customs of species he had little interest in. It would be cataloged in the archive, filed away for future reference. Perhaps one day, when humanity's role in the galactic community became clearer, he would return to it. For now, it was little more than a curious, if overly emotional, sentiment. After the meeting, T'Valor left the room and continued his duties. He had spent years studying the dynamics of interstellar politics and war. Humans were not a threat to the Dominion. They had nothing to offer. Their chaos would burn itself out, just like the lesser species before them. But later, during the Dominion's war simulation, an exercise against the Sauriac incursion fleet, T'Valor would remember those words again. And this time, he would begin to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to Captain Ava Ramirez and her strange, unspoken truths. The Vrethan glided silently through the void, a cathedral of cold logic wrapped in titanium alloy. Every hallway was a line drawn straight, every chamber a monument to control. The Xelari Dominion did not believe in curves or warmth. Beauty was found in symmetry, in purpose, in silence. And yet, in one corner of this floating monument to intellect, there was laughter. T'Valor found himself once again observing the human delegation, not from a place of duty, but of curiosity, though he would never have admitted it aloud. Their cultural presence aboard the ship was limited to a small exchange space retrofitted for comfort at the human ambassador's insistence. A few soft chairs, an inefficient and archaic heating coil, and a stack of printed books, paper of all things. It was a strange mockery of their own quarters, as if they had attempted to graft earth onto the spine of a Xelari warship. At the center of it all was Captain Ava Ramirez. She sat cross-legged on the floor in uniform, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, retelling a story about something called a road trip involving a poorly trained monkey, a flat tire, and an antique guitar. T'Valor had no frame of reference for most of the details, and yet the other humans laughed, heads thrown back, joy echoing off the unyielding walls. Even a few Dominion liaisons in the room showed subtle signs of mirth, an uptick in vocalization frequency, a shift in posture. Inappropriate, but interesting. He stepped forward from the corridor where he had been watching. Not hiding. He did not hide, but lingering with intention. Ava caught sight of him, raised her chin, and smiled as though she had expected him all along. "T'Valor," she said brightly, "come to hear the one about the toaster and the malfunctioning AI?" "I came to ensure cultural protocols were being followed," he replied, more curtly than he intended. "Right," she said, unconvinced. "Protocol enforcement through eavesdropping." He blinked. "Xelari do not eavesdrop. We observe without insertion." "Sounds like eavesdropping with extra steps," she said, then patted the floor next to her. "Come on, sit. We're exchanging cultures. You might learn something." He hesitated. She was undisciplined, her speech unfiltered, full of idioms and poetic distortions. But there was an undeniable gravitational pull in her presence. Not dominance, not manipulation. Something gentler, something like heat. He sat, carefully arranging his limbs into a meditative posture. Around them, the laughter quieted. The others gave him respectful space, though not out of deference, he suspected, but because they did not want to interrupt something forming. Ava reached toward a kettle resting over the coil and began pouring again. Steam rose into the sterile air. You know, she said, not offering him a cup this time. Back on Earth, when things get really rough, war, loss, disaster, we don't just survive. We gather. Around fire, around warmth, around stories. T'Valor considered this. That seems inefficient. Surely your resources will be better spent on rebuilding, strategizing. Maybe, but rebuilding without connection means nothing. Survival without meaning is just waiting to die. He tilted his head. You anthropomorphize survival. Assign it value beyond the biological imperative. We do, she agreed, because we're more than cells clinging to a rock. We're stories. We're memory. She leaned back on her hands, eyes fixed somewhere past the ceiling. I remember being 12 years old when my city lost power during a winter blackout. Everything shut down. Heat, comms, everything. My family lit candles and huddled in the living room under blankets, drinking bad instant coffee and listening to my abuelo tell stories about escaping a military regime. Her gaze dropped to meet his. I remember that night more vividly than I remember last Tuesday, because I felt safe, connected, warm. T'Valor processed her words in silence. In Xelari culture, memory was categorized, archived, and rarely revisited emotionally. Historical relevance was objective. Subjective interpretation was discarded. You cling to emotion as though it is sacred, he said eventually. Not sacred, just necessary. Why? He asked, genuinely curious. She studied him. Because it makes us human, and sometimes it makes us dangerous. T'Valor stiffened. Dangerous? She grinned. In a good way. There was silence for a time. He watched her sip from her ceramic cup, a motion that repeated with ceremonial regularity. There was no stimulant involved, he reminded himself. No measurable gain. And yet, the ritual calmed her, grounded her. He began to suspect that for humans, ritual wasn't about outcome. It was about meaning. I have reviewed your species' historical record, T'Valor said. You burn easily. You destroy what you build. And yet, you continue to rebuild. It is contradictory. Fire consumes, Ava agreed. But it also creates. It tempers steel. It powers engines. It lights the way. The words struck him. They weren't just metaphors to her. They were truths. You are chaotic, he said. We are. And you view this as a strength. She raised her cup in mock salute. We do. T'Valor sat in silence. Somewhere behind his thoughts, her earlier phrase echoed again. Hell teaches you how to build fire. At first he had dismissed it as nonsense. Now he wasn't so sure. There was logic to it, buried beneath layers of instinct and cultural fog. Perhaps there were forms of wisdom that could not be diagrammed. He stood slowly. Your people are more layered than expected. She gave a slow nod. We tend to surprise. I will return for further observation, he said. Ava smirked. Looking forward to it, Archivist. As he exited the room, the sound of quiet conversation and light laughter followed him down the corridor. He realized he was walking slower than usual, that his mind was spinning on tangents not previously charted. He had not expected warmth. Not here. Not from them. He paused at a viewport and stared into the stars. Heat and light, he thought. In a place built from shadow, the war room aboard the Vrethen was an altar to precision. Its walls shimmered with embedded data streams, glowing with tactical overlays and real-time threat assessments. Three-dimensional models of enemy fleets hovered in midair, endlessly rotating in perfect silence. Rows of Dominion officers moved in unison, each one executing simulations with the fluidity of machines. No wasted movements. No speculation. Strategy here was not art, it was algorithm. Archivist T'Valor stood at the back of the observation gallery, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the main simulation grid. He'd observed 1,000 war games in his career, cataloged the behavioral patterns of enemies and allies alike. The Soriak incursion fleet was a known quantity, brutal, efficient, and direct. In the simulation, their approach was, as it always was, overwhelming force, calculated ruthlessness, a cascade of cold inevitability. He'd seen this outcome before. And yet, today, something was different. Status report. Commander Ithrax barked from the operations platform below. A junior officer responded crisply. Simulated Dominion fleet has suffered projected losses of 62% within 8 minutes. Final outcome: complete annihilation. Standard phalanx formation proves ineffective against Soriak assault doctrine. Expected, Ithrax replied. Reset for formation variant Gamma 7. Before the cycle could begin, a voice cut across the chamber. Unfamiliar, irreverent. Actually, said Captain Ava Ramirez, leaning casually against the rail just beside T'Valor, we'd like to suggest an alternative. Every Xelari head turned. It wasn't just the interruption, it was the audacity. Humans had been invited to observe, not participate. Their role was passive, their insights unsolicited. T'Valor's eyes narrowed. This wasn't protocol. This was intrusion. Commander Ithrax peered up at her, his face impassive but his tone laced with irritation. Human representative, you're not authorized to alter Dominion war simulations. Ava shrugged. You invited us here to learn. Learning goes both ways. A pause. Thin, sharp tension stretched across the room. T'Valor stepped forward. What alternative do you propose, Captain? She glanced at him. There was no smugness in her expression, just that relentless spark behind her eyes. We call it ghost flanking, she said, a misdirection maneuver designed around emotional projection and false vulnerability. Instead of meeting the Soriak head-on, you show them something they want to see: weakness, an exposed flank. And when they commit to it, you spring the trap. T'Valor blinked. You are suggesting we intentionally appear compromised? Exactly, Ava said. Let them think they've won. Draw them in. Then hit them where it hurts. One of the junior officers frowned. That contradicts core Dominion doctrine. Vulnerability invites collapse. Ava nodded. That's the difference. You see vulnerability as failure. We use it as bait. The chamber went still. Then, to T'Valor's surprise, Commander Ithrax gestured toward the simulation grid. Load their strategy, he ordered. Let us see how the fire dances. T'Valor watched as the scenario reset. Dominion ships repositioned, falling into a deliberately fragmented formation. 2 capital vessels appeared to lag behind. Their engine signatures were dampened, giving the impression of system failure. The Soriak, as predicted, adjusted course to capitalize on the apparent breakdown. Ava's voice was low and steady. Now watch. The crippled vessels suddenly came alive, engines surging with hidden reserves. They flanked the Soriak advance, intersecting its trajectory, while a decoy unit ignited a cascade of simulated reactor overloads, just enough to simulate panic. The Soriak line overcommit. Their front collapsed. Within 5 moves, the Dominion fleet, using human design tactics, achieved a decisive victory. Not a statistical anomaly, not a lucky outcome. A rout. Silence fell across the chamber. Then came the murmurs. Officers exchanging glances. Tactical advisors rechecking their models. One of them leaned toward T'Valor and whispered, as though it were a confession, they won. T'Valor's thoughts drifted back, coffee steam rising, laughter echoing, words spoken too casually to be taken as prophecy. We've been through hell. But hell teaches you how to build fire. He turned to Ava, who was watching the grid quietly, arms crossed, not gloating. Just calm, like this was expected. How did you arrive at this maneuver? He asked her. She shrugged. Old Earth trick. Used to call it a rope-a-dope. You lean into the hit until your opponent thinks you're down. Then you strike. Emotionally manipulative, T'Valor noted. Strategically human, she countered. Commander Ithrax stepped forward, his posture rigid. Captain Ramirez, your maneuver succeeded. But your method is, he hesitated, visibly struggling to phrase it with appropriate diplomatic tact. Chaotic. Your tactics rely on projection, intuition, and emotional deception. These are not principles the Dominion cultivates. Ava met his gaze evenly. No offense, Commander, but maybe that's why you keep losing to the Sauriac. You think if you follow all the rules, you can't be beaten. But the Sauriac don't care about your rules. Neither do we. The words hung heavy. T'Valor stepped between them, voice neutral. We will review the data. Carefully. Ava didn't push. She simply nodded, then turned and walked out, the weight of the moment trailing behind her like smoke. Later that night, T'Valor stood alone in his private chambers, reviewing the simulation footage again. Frame by frame, he dissected every turn, every signal flare, every angle. He tried to break it down with Xelari logic, but the outcome refused to yield to standard metrics. It had worked, undeniably, not because of firepower, not because of superior design, because of something else, something harder to define. Emotion as a tool, vulnerability as a weapon, chaos as a strategy. He replayed the audio log of her voice, calm, deliberate. Let them think they've won. Draw them in, then hit them where it hurts. He turned toward the small shelf by his desk. There it sat still, untouched, the small ceramic container she had left behind. Cold now, long since the heat had faded, but the scent still lingered faintly. Coffee. It wasn't just a drink. It wasn't just hospitality. It was a message. They'd faced extinction. They'd burned and broken and rebuilt with nothing but stubbornness and imagination. And somehow, against all odds, they hadn't just survived. They'd learned how to set the rules on fire. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he opened a new log. Log entry, Archivist T'Valor. Event classification update. Minor diplomatic encounter. Reevaluation complete. Preliminary recommendation. Integrate human tactical variability into Dominion war doctrine. Annotation. Phrase, hell teaches you how to build fire, is no longer metaphorical. It is strategic insight. Dominion High Command responded to the simulation victory with the speed and unease of an empire too proud to admit it had blinked. T'Valor watched the internal channels swell with controlled commentary. Tactical divisions were evaluating anomalous variables. Fleet Command dispatched efficiency analysts to review integration viability. No one used the word human directly. It was as if naming the source might give it too much power, as though the fire would spread if acknowledged. Still, the data couldn't be denied. The simulation logs had gone viral across several Dominion vessels. Some officers privately recreated the scenario and tested variants. Others dismissed it as luck or soft logic chaos. The divide was forming, quiet but widening, a crack in the Dominion's marble certainty. T'Valor had begun to notice shifts in behavior. Conversations clipped short when he entered the room, more frequent glances toward the humans in shared corridors, an increase in requests to review cultural protocols. It was fear, not of the humans themselves. No, they were still small, unarmored, loud. But fear of what they represented. Unpredictability with results. He hadn't seen Ava Ramirez since the simulation. She'd returned to her temporary quarters in the human section of the Vrethan, a warm pocket of gravity-warped nostalgia nestled within a monolith of precision. T'Valor hesitated outside the entryway now, his hand raised to chime, then paused. Why was he here? Not for duty, not for observation. Something deeper, something more dangerous. He pressed the chime. Come in, her voice called, muffled but familiar. The door hissed open. Inside, the space was dimly lit by a faux electric lantern. A recording played low on a portable speaker. Acoustic strings and a raw, human voice singing of heartbreak and distance. T'Valor stepped into the warmth and immediately felt out of place. The walls were adorned with what humans called photos, still images, frozen memory fragments. A family, a dog, a burning sunset over something called Big Sur. None of it was useful. All of it was meaningful. Ava sat on the floor, sipping from the same ceramic cup. She looked up and gave him a tired smile. Didn't expect you tonight, she said. Thought you'd be busy rewriting doctrine. T'Valor tilted his head. Doctrine does not rewrite itself. It must first admit error. Ah, she said, raising her cup. There's the Dominion I know. He remained standing. I came to understand. Not the tactics. You've already explained those. I need to understand you. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Me? Your species, but specifically you. You said something once. About hell and fire. I thought nonsense. Now I believe it may be something else. Ava exhaled slowly and gestured to the opposite side of the room. Sit down, T'Valor. You're not here to study me like a lab rat. You're here because something inside you is burning, and you don't know what to call it yet. He sat, though stiffly. We are not built for fire. You're wrong, she said. You've just forgotten. They sat in silence for a time, the music fading out, replaced only by the hum of distant engines. Why do you keep it? He asked, nodding at the cup. She smiled. Because it reminds me of Earth. Mornings before the world got loud. Soldiers sharing warmth in silence before battle. It's a link, a thread. Something small enough to carry, but big enough to anchor you. T'Valor considered that. The Dominion teaches us to abandon anchors. Attachment invites distortion. Maybe distortion is where truth lives, Ava replied. We're not born knowing how to survive. We learn through pain. Fire teaches. Burns, sure, but it illuminates too. He leaned forward, shadows flickering across his face. Do you truly believe your people can survive the galactic stage with sentiment? Her eyes didn't flinch. We already have. Not because we're stronger, but because we don't fit. We adapt. We get knocked down, we improvise. We turn our grief into drive, our mess into movement. You think fire is dangerous because it spreads. But what scares you isn't the fire. It's the idea that it might change you. T'Valor sat back, as if struck. For a long time, he stared at the object in front of him. The cup. Plain, ceramic, no ornamentation. It should have been irrelevant. But here it was again, like a persistent question. We thought you were primitive, he said softly. Disorganized. Emotionally compromised. We are, she said with a grin. But we're also relentless. We remember every loss. And sometimes, remembering hurts, but we carry the pain like coals. Until we need the flame. He looked up. That is not in any of your strategic texts. Then maybe your problem isn't with our tactics, Ava said, voice gentle now. Maybe your problem is with how we keep finding ways to matter. Outside, the stars wheeled endlessly. Inside, the small space flickered with meaning. T'Valor rose, but not to leave. He walked to the table and reached toward the ceramic cup she'd set down. His fingers brushed the handle. Still warm. He lifted it. Not to drink. Not yet. But to hold it. To feel its weight. And for the first time, he didn't catalog the action. He felt it. He met Ava's eyes. We may need more of these. She smiled. I'll show you how to make a pot. Log entry, Archivist T'Valor. Subject, human designation, Captain Ava Ramirez. Cultural assessment revision, in progress. New consideration, emotional transference as strategic asset. Further analysis required. Initial conclusion. Fire is not merely a human trait. The cup still sat where she left it. Archivist T'Valor stared at it for a long time, motionless. It had become more than a physical object, more than a trinket from a strange visitor species. It was a symbol now, a contradiction, a challenge, and perhaps, if he was being honest with himself, a beginning. The ceramic container, infused with residual warmth and the faint scent of burnt beans, had ignited something in him that no data stream or strategic model ever had. Curiosity, yes, but also discomfort, and in the discomfort, change. He had spent the past rotation reviewing the cumulative data logs on humanity, their conflicts, their history, their music, their improvisational warfare, their unpredictable diplomacy. He'd pored over not just tactical documents, but raw media, fiction, philosophy, humor, heartbreak. It was madness at first glance, incoherent. But underneath it all was something stubbornly consistent, resilience through chaos. A civilization that had repeatedly flirted with extinction and learned to dance through the fire. Now, as he recorded his final summary for the Dominion Council, he found his usual certainty absent. Log entry, final. Subject, human integration potential. Captain Ava Ramirez, representative. Assessment status, complete. He paused. His finger hovered over the record button. Something resisted closure. Instead, he turned back to the viewport, watching the stars. Endless, distant, unmoved, just like the Dominion preferred. But now, something in their stillness felt hollow. There was no warmth in perfection. A soft chime broke the silence. He turned. The door to his quarters slid open. Unauthorized entry protocol momentarily overridden. But he already knew who it was. Captain Ava Ramirez stepped inside, hands tucked into the pockets of her faded fleet jacket. She had that same quiet energy, the kind that moved through a room without raising its voice. She looked tired, but more than that, she looked settled, like someone who had faced judgment and come through intact. "You left before the closing ceremony," she said, not accusing, just observant. "I had no further observations to record," T'Valor replied. "You sure about that?" She nodded toward the cup on the table. "I see it's still here." He gestured toward it. "I don't understand why I didn't discard it. It holds no nutritional value, no cultural relevance to our customs. Yet, it means something now," she said, stepping closer. "Not because of what it is, but because of what it reminds you of." "You mean you," he said. She smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe what we represent to you now." He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned toward the bench. She sat without hesitation. T'Valor faced her, and for once, the mask of neutral observation fell. "We believed you were inefficient, loud, sentimental. We are. But that's not the whole truth." "No," she said. "It never is." He leaned forward. "Your tactics in the simulation worked because you embrace unpredictability. You use it. You shape it. You let your instincts speak louder than your calculations." She nodded. "Because sometimes instincts remember what intellect tries to forget." "You broke our model," he said. "That was never the point." "Then what was the point?" Ava looked at him for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the usual warmth. It was something else, something heavier. "Because one day, you're going to face something that logic can't beat. Not brute force. Not perfect formation. Something that cracks your doctrine open like an old hull. And when that day comes, you'll either have fire or you'll freeze." T'Valor was quiet. Then, slowly, he reached for the cup. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the glaze, the imperfections in the handmade surface. 1,000 Dominion-crafted objects were more elegant, more functional, but none of them felt human. He lifted it toward his lips. Ava raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Might scramble your entire neural stack." "I'm not drinking it," he said. "Not yet, but I need to feel what it means. To hold it. To remember this." She watched him closely. "Then maybe we did our job. I have reclassified your visit," he said. "This was not a minor diplomatic encounter. No, this was first contact." She smiled slowly. "Took you long enough." They sat in silence, two figures from two distant worlds, bound by a small, warm cup and the echoes of fire. After a while, Ava stood. "We're shipping out tomorrow. Back to Earth for now." T'Valor rose as well. "Will you return?" She shrugged. "Depends. Will you still be here?" He considered the question, then gave a rare, quiet smile. "We may have to upgrade our hospitality protocols." At the door, she turned one last time. "You know, we don't build fire because we want to watch the world burn. We build fire because the dark is vast, and we refuse to face it cold." Then she was gone. T'Valor stood alone again, but it didn't feel like before. He returned to his terminal. No more hesitation. Updated log entry. Event classification. Strategic cultural turning point. Subject. Human designation. Captain Ava Ramirez. Species potential. High-impact adaptive force. Recommendation. Initiate ongoing collaboration. Additional notes. Emotional frameworks may enhance Dominion flexibility under non-standard threat vectors. Symbolic artifact. Ceramic coffee cup. Retained. Not discarded. Personal addendum. They build fire. And now, so might we. He looked at the cup one last time. And this time, he didn't just hold it. He took a sip. The taste was bitter, alien, sharp, but it was warm, and it was real. and in the quiet of his quarters aboard the most logical vessel in the galaxy, Archivist T'Valor, model of Dominion.